Welcome, everyone, to the Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old, historian, surfer, and world traveler. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting some of the latest scholarly research in humanities, social sciences, and surf studies. So paddle out with us while we glide through the world of academia. For today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Donald Wright. Don is a Canadian historian at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, a small city in Atlantic Canada. His research interests include Canadian political, intellectual, and cultural history, and Don teaches courses in Canadian and American history, as well as in the politics of climate change. For this episode, Don and I will be talking about his book, Canada, A Very Short Introduction, which is a book he published as part of Oxford University Press's Very Short Introduction series. I'm super stoked to have you on the show, Don. But before we get started, I'd like to thank you, as well as our listeners, for being part of another amazing episode of the Surfing Historian.
Listen, Jason, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of podcasts. I like the Surfing Historian. And when you invited me, of course, I jumped at the chance. As you know, my research is on Canadian history. I'm a Canadian historian. I did my PhD at the University of Ottawa, and I briefly crossed paths with one of your mentors, Kees Botterblum, a former guest on your show. We were at McGill together a million years ago. My research interests include Canadian history, Canadian intellectual history. I'm especially interested in biography and how biography can help us understand historical processes at the level of the individual. And right now I'm writing a book about the Canadian historian Ramsay Cook, who was a much-loved figure in Canadian academia who died a few years ago. So yeah, that's me. I'm Don Wright. I'm a Canadian historian, and I'm super excited to be on the Surfing Historian.
Don, yeah, thanks for coming on. And it's good to have you on. It's good to meet you. And, I'm personally excited to learn a lot more about your research, Canadian history, and, everything, we're going to talk about today. And so I guess I want to just get right into it. Your book, the one that we're going to talk about today, is called Canada, A Very Short Introduction. And so it's not necessarily a short book, though. But apart from that, what actually compelled you to want to write this brief history?
Excellent question, Jason. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the series. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's called the VSI, or Very Short Introduction series. And I think there's some 600, close to 700 books in that series on everything from American history, Australian history, Scottish history, on the French Revolution, on the American Revolution, on the American West. There's very short introductions to geophysics, very short introductions to time, very short introductions to political philosophy. In any event, I'm a huge fan of that series. And a few years ago, the editors reached out to me saying, would you be interested in writing, because we don't have a Canadian book in that series, would you be interested in writing a very short introduction to Canada? Well, of course, I jumped at the opportunity, but it took a lot longer. There's a huge process to go through. You have to write a prospectus. That prospectus has to be peer reviewed. Then it goes before the editorial board. Then the editorial board says, yes, we will issue a contract. They issue a contract. So it took a lot longer to actually get to the writing stage. And then writing the book, Jason, and here you are writing a dissertation. So I know you know what it's like to suffer through the archives and the writing and the rewriting. It's agonizing. But writing a very short book takes a very long time because you're condensing an enormous topic, in this case, the history of Canada, really from the Precambrian beginnings to Justin Trudeau in the present, in just 35,000 words. Moreover, you're expected to write for the non-specialist, somebody who's coming into the airport, the Pearson Airport in Toronto. Yeah, what is Canada? I'm going to be here for a couple of weeks. And that would be the kind of book that they would pick up to learn more about Canada. So you're writing for that elusive, educated general reader, or the PhD student who needs to cram for a field the night before. or the high school student who has to quickly write an essay for the next day. So it's for the non-specialized audience. It's a huge topic. So writing the book took a lot longer than I had hoped. But I'm kind of happy with the end product. I thought long and hard about it, how I wanted to break up the chapters and how I wanted to tell those stories within the chapters. I mean, I'll leave it for others to comment on its quality. You never review your own books, and you're never as good as your own press. But I'm kind of pleased with it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed, going through the book. And obviously, I spend most of my time writing on Latin America. And, as you mentioned, my dissertation is focusing on Nicaragua. So certainly not Canada. But, and you mentioned how you decided to put the book together. You alluded to it. You didn't really talk about it. And so that was really what I'd like, for the listener who's interested in the book itself. Could you go into a little bit more detail as to how you chose to divide up the chapters or the themes? Like, in what way did what made you divide it up the way you did?
Yeah, excellent question. I chose, well, first of all, I should back up a second. You're given a very strict contract from Oxford University Press. They want short, snappy chapters, no more than 35,000 words in total, no notes. So you can't have any explanatory footnotes. Anything you put in has to be in the text. So you're working within those constraints. But I wanted that reader, the elusive general reader, to be able to pick it up and to look at it and read it and take something away, to have an understanding of Canada. So I broke it up into, into 6 chapters. The first one was on beginning. The Precambrian beginnings, the retreat of the great ice sheets, the melting of the great ice sheets, and the formation of the Canadian landscape, and then the migration of the Paleo-Indians across the Bering Strait and down into North America and across North America into what is now Eastern Canada. And then, of course, you move very quickly into European, and I use this word in quotation marks, discovery, exploration, settlement, and the inevitable conflicts that come out of settler colonialism. So that first chapter sets the stage. It introduces Indigenous peoples. It introduces the French and the French fact in North America, and then it introduces the British conquest in 1759 and the British fact in what is now Canada. So Canada is this bilingual, multinational country with its origins in in the case of Indigenous peoples, 10,000 years ago, in case of European peoples, in the 16th and 17th centuries into the 19th century. So that sets the stage for the remaining chapters. I gave each chapter one word because I wanted the reader, and that was actually very difficult, not so much picking the word, but as a writer, you will know this, Jason, your title boxes you in or opens you up. So when you pick a single word title, you're very bound, and you have to build all the subsequent topics within that chapter around that single word. But I wanted the reader to take away these words and have this instant, instinctive understanding of Canada. So the next chapter was called Dispossessions, and that was about the historical and ongoing dispossessions of Native peoples in Canada. And that is much in the news these days because of the very tragic discovery of unmarked graves at the sites of former residential schools where Indigenous children were sent across the late 19th and into the 20th century. But I wanted readers to understand that history is still in the present, that just because it happened in the past doesn't mean it's not still unfolding in the present, and that dispossessions are still, they're historical, but they are unfolding in the present as we deal with the legacy of what happened between settlers and the settler state and Indigenous peoples, and so on and so on. So I had these 6 chapters. I pluralized each chapter because history is enormously complex. So beginning, there wasn't a single beginning in Canada. There were beginnings. There was the Indigenous beginning, there was the French beginning, there was the British beginning. There wasn't a single dispossession. There was no single event that dispossessed Indigenous peoples. Moreover, different Indigenous peoples were dispossessed at different times. And so each chapter is pluralized, which made it, again, more of a challenge. But I think at the end of the day, and I'll leave it for others to decide, Jason. You never believe your own press. I'll leave it for others to decide whether it's good or not. But at the end of the day, I think it gives readers a good, quick introduction to Canada.
Yeah, I agree. And, I'm glad you stopped just shy of chapter 3, because I wanted to ask you about it and even hone in a bit on that chapter, which you titled Nationalisms. And, it traces the histories of Canada's current nations, and you've divided those into 4 entities: Quebec, English Canada, First Nations, and also Newfoundland. And so would you mind, sort of segueing out of what you were just talking about, how you broke up the chapters and sort of the early history of Canada, but would you mind elaborating a bit more on as to why you chose these, quote unquote, national entities within Canada?
Well, look, Canada is a really interesting country precisely because it is a multinational country with different nationalisms. There's no single national identity in Canada. There is an English Canadian national identity. There is obviously Quebec. Quebec sees itself as a nation, La Nation de Québec. Quebec provincial capital, Quebec City, is La Capitale Nationale du Québec. And then, of course, First Nations, beginning in the 1960s, 1970s, Indigenous peoples began to draw on that language of nationalism and identify as the Cree Nation or the Mi'kmaq Nation or the Haida Nation, and so on and so on. The Dene Nation. They used the language of nationalism because it is a very powerful language of being autonomous, having a history, having an identity, having a destiny. And then, of course, in Canada, because it's remarkably complicated, there's Newfoundland. And Newfoundland, until it became a province of Canada quite late in 1949, was a self-governing dominion in the British Empire. It wasn't, always a province of Canada. Again, it has its own historical memory of having been independent. It's now a province, of course, but even Newfoundland has its own store of national holidays, national stories, national symbols. And so that chapter on nationalisms really drives home that point that there is not this single national identity in Canada, that it is a multinational country made up of at least 3, if not 4, if you include Quebec nations, each with their own store of holidays, symbols, songs, stories. And it makes it incredibly difficult at times, but I would argue it also makes it incredibly rich. And it allows for freedom to flourish and for identities to flourish. It's messy, it's complicated. The Canadian calendar is incredibly complicated. The national holiday in Quebec is different than the national holiday in English Canada, which is different again from the national holiday in Newfoundland. But I would argue that's a healthy thing, that it allows diversity and complexity and messiness. I don't like neatness because the past isn't neat. I don't think historical writing should be neat. I think it should allow for complexity.
I agree. And like I said, my history or my understanding of Canada is limited. And so it's really nice to sort of get your input, get your, have a better understanding of how Canada is, in a sense, there's nationalisms with an S, so it's plural.
Sorry, I was just going to add, that's one of my favorite letters in the writing of history is S. You put S on the end of any word, and suddenly the past becomes remarkably complex, remarkably difficult to grasp, but also richer, truer. I mean, the present isn't neat and tidy. Nobody agrees on every issue. Why should the past be neat and tidy and have 100% agreement? So, that S really changes our understanding of the past.
Absolutely. And I think the way you approach this, brief history is it allows, like you said, you had to keep it within 35,000 words. That's pretty challenging, particularly when you talk about, as you were saying, the complexity of Canadian history. And so with that in mind, I was reading some of the book reviews, and it says, Wright peppers his chapters with brief vignettes of ordinary, in quotes, women and men whose lives or actions in some way embody the theme under discussion. And so would you define this book as a history from below, or, how would you define, I know it's a brief history, but more specifically, how would you define your approach to this, to Canadian history?
Wow, that's a really thoughtful question, Jason. I'm not sure it's a history from below, although I'm very influenced by social historians and the writing of social history. We all are. It was one of the great revolutions in the writing of history in the last half century, was writing from the bottom up, from the perspective of ordinary people. And when we did that in the 60s and 70s, suddenly the past just opens up and those grand narratives just collapse. They can't be contained by all of the new voices that are being included. In any event, I'm also interested in biography. And that's one of the reasons I got into history, because I'm fascinated by people, why people do the things they do, what makes them tick, and also in this idea of greatness. I mean, greatness, I think, has to be democratized. It's not just great men, prime ministers and presidents and generals and captains of industry. It's ordinary people doing great things in their everyday life. So I included people like Augie Morasti, who was a Cree man who, well, as a child, he was sent to a residential school in Saskatchewan, and residential schools were designed to turn, quote unquote, the Indian into a white person, to strip them of their language, their culture, their religion, and transform them into Euro Canadians through this curriculum, being in residence, take them off the reserves, take them away from their families. But of course, they were not every single residential school, but there was a pattern of abuse, of violence, of neglect, of appallingly high death rates. Anyways, Augie Morasti went to a residential school in the 1940s, I believe, early 50s. And it was an awful experience for him, and he experienced violence. His subsequent life, was one of substance abuse, of homelessness, but also of trapping and hunting and guiding. And much later in life, I think he was in his 80s, he wrote a very short memoir called The Education of Augie Morasti. And it was really an important book, something of a national bestseller. But I wanted to include him because he did something pretty great, right? He went to the residential schools. They were brutal. But over the course of his life, he succeeded in telling his story and having his story become part of the Canadian story. I wanted to include, because I'm very interested in queer history, I'm very interested in gay rights, very interested for personal reasons, very interested in queer history, very interested in gay rights. So I wanted to include people like Maurice Flood, who was a gay man living in Vancouver, who took one of the very, very first court cases around gay rights all the way to the Supreme Court. And although he lost at the Supreme Court, he nevertheless showed that courts could be a place to achieve rights. So I admired him greatly. I didn't know him personally, obviously, but I admired his story greatly and his conviction, and for his willingness to stand up for what he believed was right and for what was right. So again, because it's a big picture history of Canada, I didn't have a lot of space to include people like Augie Morasti or Pauline Julien, the great Quebec singer-songwriter, or Maurice Flood, the gay rights activist. But I wanted to make sure they were there because they give depth, lived experience to the narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thanks for, giving us, myself and the listeners, that background there to better understand sort of how you went about piecing this history together. And obviously I would assume we would agree that there are wide ranging ways of viewing and writing history. And one of the things that I really like, in terms of what you said is regarding Canadian history is it was plural, not singular. And that was one of the reasons you put some of your title chapters with, added the S, like, like we've already been talking about, nationalisms with an S at the end. And, I find that extremely interesting and fascinating how you've brought so much attention to the letter S in considering the history of Canada. And, one of the individuals you mentioned at the top of the show, at the top of the episode, was Ramsay Cook, and a Canadian historian. And that's somebody, I believe you're working on a book about him, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But could you fill us in on who that is, and why do you feel so compelled to write a book about this individual?
I would love to. Ramsay Cook was a Canadian historian. He was born in the 1930s. He died a few years ago in 2015, 2016. I can't remember exactly now. The pandemic has done so much to our sense of time. There's this 20-month gap in our understanding of time. In any event, he died a few years ago in 2016. I'm writing his biography to assess his contributions to Canadian intellectual life, to Canadian historical writing. But one of the reasons I admired Ramsay so much is that he understood, beginning in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, when he was doing his writing, he understood that Canadian history was not singular, it was plural. He was a student of Donald Creighton, and I realize for your listeners, Donald Creighton, it doesn't mean anything, but Donald Creighton was this great Canadian historian. And he saw himself, when he was doing his writing in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, a generation before Ramsay, he saw himself as the author of the Canadian story. And there was only one story to tell, and he would tell it. Well, Ramsay Cook, a kid from the prairies, not from Toronto, a kid from the outside, not from the inside, comes along and says, no, your story's told from downtown Toronto. It simply doesn't correspond to my lived experience growing up in the prairies. And so Ramsay, as I say, always, and he was relentlessly curious, which I admired too about him. And he pushed his students to write new books about Canada, whether it was on Italian immigrants or religious minorities or women, that Canadian history was so much bigger and so much more significant, and so much more complex than Donald Creighton gave it credit for. There was not one version of the event. There was at least 2, if not 22 versions of an event. So Ramsay Cook, in many ways, inspired this book and my approach to writing this book. And I do, in the introduction, give a brief shout out to Ramsay, because he understood that Canada included Indigenous history. It certainly, and the bulk of his work was in French Canadian history, certainly included French people and religious minorities, immigrants, and workers. I admire his approach to the writing of history. And so if I can emulate it in a small way, I'll be happy.
Yeah. And, segueing from your appreciation for Ramsay Cook, I have a quote here, and, I thought I would get your input or your thoughts on it. And it's just about history in and of itself. And it says, history is not a fixed or even a steadily expanding set of facts, but rather a way of interpreting facts, of seeing new patterns in them, of reordering their relative importance, as well as of bringing into the foreground facts that were out there in the background somewhere, but largely ignored or even suppressed. And so it really feels like your book, I know you didn't call it a history from below, but your approach really does bring a number of facts that were perhaps in the background to the foreground. And so I guess, like I said, this was a quote that I wanted to get your input on. So what are your thoughts on that? And how does this play into how you wrote this book?
That's a great quote, Jason. And I think it's probably true. History does expand over time, But history is constantly being rewritten. It's not just the addition of more facts. It's not just the addition of more figures. It's not just the addition of more people. It's being rewritten all the time because we bring new questions to it, or we uncover new archival sources, or because there's something going on in the present that makes us think differently about the past. And I think this really, what that quote's getting at is that there's a difference between the word past and history. The past is the past. We can't do anything about the past, but we can retell that story over and over and over and over again. So, you spilled milk this morning. You can't do anything about the spilled milk, but you can tell that story as comedy. You can tell that story as tragedy. You can tell that story as farce. You can tell that story in any number of ways. And it can change depending on the day of the week, right? The milk has been spilled. You can't do anything about that. But how we interpret the spilling of that milk, and let's say we interview a couple of other people who saw that milk spill. Well, they'll have a different perspective on that spilled milk. Look, I'm using a facile example, spilled milk, but there's that expression. There's no point in crying over spilled milk because you can't change the fact the milk has been spilled, but you can rewrite it all the time. And that's what to me is so interesting. The past is the past, but history is the story we tell about the past. And that story is constantly changing.
Absolutely. And I want to ask you about something you've written in this book. And, you talk about the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and you say it lasted just a few minutes, but the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, fought by historians, journalists, and politicians, has lasted over 250 years. And I think that fits well with what you were just saying about how history is viewed or how it's written. And so can you go into a little bit of history as to what was the Battle of the Plains of Abraham? And when you talk about the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, what do you mean by that?
Oh my God, those are great questions, Jason. So let's start with the first one. What was the Battle of the Plains of Abraham? It was part of the 7 Years' War in the 18th century between the French and the British empires. In many ways, it was a global war, fought on multiple fronts. But one front, of course, one theater was North America, what is today Canada and the United States. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham occurred in 1759 in Quebec City. And there, the British Army did defeat the French army, and suddenly French Canada, New France, is conquered. It is defeated, and the British Empire now really is the master of North America. Of course, that changes with the American Revolution a few years down the road, but Britain becomes the empire in North America. And that battle lasted only a few minutes, and historians, as you point out, historians, journalists, politicians have been debating it ever since. What is the meaning of that? I mean, was it the defeat of New France? Well, yes, it was. But was it the defeat of the French in North America? No, because of course there still are French people in Canada. Was it a humiliation? Many historians do refer to this humiliation that has been consistent, constant over the course of Canadian history. That there are French-speaking people in Quebec or conquered people that defeated people, that humiliated people. Others would argue, well, that's one way of looking at it, but another way of looking at it is that French and British people have been partners in the building of British North America and later Canada, and that the French language has survived despite various attempts to assimilate French Canadians through various means. The French language has survived into the present, and today Canada is a bilingual country, two official languages, and French is secure in Canada, no question. Some historians have argued that this historical tragedy took place, and that for Quebec to achieve its normal development, that those wrongs have to be righted, and that Quebec has to be separate and independent, that its normal colonial development from colony to nation was thwarted. And so the separatist movement in Quebec, which is a very strong movement, no question, and they do send members to the National Assembly in Quebec, and they do send members of Parliament to Ottawa, advocating for the separation of Quebec from Canada. They argue that the conquest was the founding trauma of Quebec, that the Battle of the Plains of Abraham was the founding trauma of Quebec, and to undo that trauma and to right the wrongs, Quebec must be independent, in the same way that every colony achieves that order or development from colony to nation. But English Canadian historians argue otherwise, that New France was a fledgling colony. Some historians have argued that it was attached to the British Empire, a more dynamic empire, and saved New France from a feudal system of land tenure of New France, and introduced a new dynamic and new energy into New France. And look, that debate goes on, and it's made even more complicated because Indigenous people say, look, the clash of two empires on the Plains of Abraham in 1759, that was epiphenomenal, right? It was to us just nothing, because the real story of Canada is not, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the defeat of the French, and the reconciliation of French and English over time. The real story of Canada is the forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples. And whether it's by the French Empire or the British Empire, didn't really matter. That's the story of the colonial era. So again, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham was epiphenomenal in the story of Indigenous history. So again, it's a neat way of thinking about both Canadian history, that there was this battle, but that battle is fought in books and speeches and in newspapers for 250 years. And it's also a neat way of thinking about just the complexity of Canada. It's French, it's English, it's Indigenous, and we're still having that conversation, still trying to reconcile these, and going back to the word you talked about before, reconcile these nationalisms in Canada.
Yeah, Don, absolutely. And I feel like I keep coming back to that chapter, the one on nationalisms, because it seems like it's at the heart of really what you want to convey in this book. It's been really exciting to talk about, what you've written about and your passion for Canada and your passion for these different entities. But I want to shift gears just slightly and address one of the reviews I found about your book. And so this individual gave you a solid 4-star review, but said you are strident in your woke progressivism. And so what does that even mean, first of all, when you read that? And what is your response to those who read the book and share that opinion?
Wow. Okay. First of all, that's an hilarious review. I thought that was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. And she still gave me a 4-star review on Amazon. I'll say a couple of things. One, strident, I thought was a bit much. I don't think I'm strident, so I would push back on that. But if he wants to, or she wants to call me a woke progressive, then I will wear that badge with honor and enthusiasm. Because look, woke is used as an insult. It's used to silence people. But really, what are they insulting? What are they trying to silence? It's anti-racism. It's multiculturalism. It's an insistence on thinking about history from the bottom up. It's insisting that the great men maybe weren't all that great after all. It's insisting that we think about residential schools and the ongoing role that residential schools play in the dispossessions of Native peoples, and so on and so on. So I will wear that badge honorably, woke progressive. I don't think I was strident, but yeah, I thought that was hilarious. It was good fun. Woke, it's like calling somebody politically correct because it's just a rhetorical technique to silence them or to dismiss them. It doesn't mean you have to engage with what they're writing. It doesn't mean you have to engage with what they're thinking. You don't have to engage with them at all. You can just dismiss them, put them in a box. But like you, Jason, I want to talk to people. I want to engage with people. I want to have conversations, because that's how we achieve a measure of understanding and mutual respect.
Yeah, I appreciate you addressing that review in such a, having such a good sense of humor about it as well. Because, I know how hard it is to put together research and put something out there, and then to, you sort of open yourself up to others' criticisms, certainly. And so, but with that, considering, what you were saying, you want to engage with people, and just considering the book itself, for those who end up reading it, and for those you continue to engage with, I want to go ahead and give you the last word. But really, I guess in doing so, I'd like to know what you hope people gain from reading the book. And furthermore, what are some takeaways that you'd like for myself and the listeners, to walk away with from this episode about Canadian history?
Oh boy, excellent question, Jason. What do I hope readers take away? I hope they take away that Canada is a fascinating country with an interesting history, that it can't be reduced to simple stereotypes, that for all the mistakes that have taken place in Canada, certainly the dispossessions of Native peoples has to be at the top of the list, that it is fundamentally a decent, humane country. Bilingualism is important. 2 official languages. Multiculturalism is important. I mean, multiculturalism, we haven't talked about that, but that is such an important feature of Canadian history and Canadian identity. Canada is a multicultural country. Long history of immigration, and it is now relying on immigration to maintain a population. Between 250, perhaps 300,000 people come to Canada every year. And Canada, beginning in the 1970s, under Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, under Pierre Trudeau, centered multiculturalism and made it public policy, and even included a statement of multiculturalism in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. And it is the only charter or similar document that includes a statement of multiculturalism. So Canada has made the diversity, the remarkable diversity of this country, and transformed it into a virtue. And I don't want to get misty-eyed and all kumbaya, I love you, you love me. God knows there's racism. God knows there's racialized poverty. God knows there's a ugly history of settler colonialism. But the point is, Canada is struggling to, as I say, accommodate diversity, accommodate French-speaking people through bilingualism, and accommodate the remarkable racial, ethnic, and religious diversity of Canada through multiculturalism. And I think if readers take away that and say that, there's something of value going on up here, I'll be pleased. But again, I want to be very clear too, and maybe this is where that person on Amazon is coming at me. I want to be very clear. I know racism exists, and I know that racialized poverty is real. But as I say, on balance, it's a decent society that is struggling with policies like bilingualism, multiculturalism to accommodate diversity. And history gives us, and Jason, some of your guests have talked about this, history gives us many examples of societies that have chosen far worse models than bilingualism, far worse models than multiculturalism to organize themselves. Listen, Jason, I can't thank you enough for having me. It's been really great meeting you. I wish you the best of luck in your dissertation. It's a really cool topic you're onto. You're bringing sports, you're bringing culture, you're bringing tourism, you're bringing politics, you're bringing neoliberalism all together to tell the story of surfing and a surfing culture and a surfing community in Nicaragua. So good on you, man. And the best of luck. And I look forward to following your research going forward.
I hope you enjoyed this episode on Canadian history with Dr. Donald Wright. That concludes our first season of The Surfing Historian, and it's definitely been an amazing ride. This season, we've explored wide-ranging history topics from Dutch colonialism, Confederate cultural memory, and U.S. naval history, among many others, as well as topics within the field of critical surf studies, such as surfing in the age of COVID-19, surf feminism, surfonomics, politics and surfing, as well as innovative methods and more sustainable approaches to surfing itself. Over the course of these 17 episodes, we've reached a global audience and have listeners on every continent except for Antarctica. Hopefully we can entice those listeners down there with next season's awesome podcast lineup. Stay tuned for season 2. We'll have new guests, new topics, and a brand new vibe. This has been another episode of The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay stoked.